Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me again. I've got Will Dixon joining me today, and we're going to talk about cyber resilience. So thank you, Will, for your time today from sunny Switzerland. I'm assuming it's sunny. It looks sunny in the video. And I wanted to start off just by maybe asking you a bit about yourself. Tell us about yourself, your background.
Um, Absolutely. Thanks, Mike, for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation. So, the first part of my career was working in UK government, and I was involved in cyber investigations and conducting cyber operations, largely concentrating on detecting and investigating and ultimately prosecuting high-tech crime teams that would pose the most significant threats to the UK. And they came from a um, largely jurisdictions that were overseas. And then from that, I was working at Barclays Bank, where I was part of the chief security office and part of kind of like a large international bank building their security program. And then from that, I've come to the World Economic Forum, and I'm in charge of the World Economic Forum cybersecurity program. So at the World Economic Forum, it's obviously a large international organization, probably best well known for convening the Davos meeting um, each year in Switzerland. And I work with all our members and partners from the public and private sector on discussing the most significant topics that impact global businesses and major public policy issues. And for about 2-3 years, the World Economic Forum has been identifying that cybersecurity is one of those top tier risks that their leaders and members want to talk about. So that's the program I run here.
Superb. Again, I'm well overqualified by you, outqualified, not overqualified. I'm outqualified by you in the cyberspace, but hopefully I've got a little bit on the resilience space to balance it off. But what does resilience mean to you, Will?
So I think um, the experience at Barclays and the experience of WEF has given me like quite a different perspective on what cyber resilience ultimately means, depending on the stakeholders you're dealing with. I think when I was in first line and working like in a SOC within Barclays Bank, I think it was about maintaining the integrity of the technology and services which the kind of like the bank and the institution depended on to be able to kind of like um, deliver, its functions. I think when I've come to the WEF and you're kind of like you're moving up, where you're kind of like you're very much dealing with kind of like senior leadership. Yes, they understand that kind of cyber resilience is about maintaining the kind of technology they're dependent on, but actually increasingly it's about maintaining the integrity of their business, its reputation, ensuring trust within its services with its customers, which is not just a technology issue. It's ensuring that they have all the right processes and controls to be able to deal with incidents and deal with operational issues, but also deal with communication issues and deal with regulators and the whole kind of holistic nature of kind of maintaining trust in their business outside of the technology space as well.
And I think that's an interesting point to kind of get stuck into, right? Because a lot of people will think that cyber equals technology, right? And so cyber, and to be fair, cyber generally does imply that there is some sort of attack on technology, or technology is involved in the chain. Now, it's difficult for technology not to be involved in any event in this day and age, but people often forget that the first port of call really with any cyber attack is probably going to be a human, and probably going to be some sort of a phishing, some email, some website, something that basically is engineering that human to open the door to
Yes, absolutely.
organization. So when you think about how we would be more resilient against cyber events, where would you start?
Yeah, so what's incredible about cybersecurity in many ways is that it's often seen as this incredibly technical domain. And yes, it is a technical domain, but you're right. Still, 90% of most successful attacks are basically phishing emails and people clicking on links, gaining a foothold in networks and being able to conduct an attack. So ensuring kind of like a culture of cyber resilience, I think within an organization is probably the most kind of like important priority. And the reason why I talk about like a culture of cyber resilience is it means that kind of like cybersecurity is not only an issue for the cybersecurity and security team, but it's ensuring that you kind of like your organization is like building a end-to-end culture of kind of like building cybersecurity. resilience, because, like you said, what's the most effective controls as an organization that you could put in? You can have like incredibly fancy, like, detection capability to detect attacks, but if you've got 100,000 employees and they're kind of like consistently clicking on links that are suspicious because they've had no training, it's kind of like, what's the most effective way of like building an effective security culture there as well? So yeah, it's and that has definitely been something that I learned at Barclays, actually, which was, obviously I was in kind of like one of the more forward-leaning kind of like technical parts of the security function, but you realize that there was just this entire organizational change that actually needed to be embedded to build like real cyber resilience.
Yeah, and I think it's getting that culture into every part of the bank is really difficult. There are
Yeah.
people that just would never think that they were part of the solution of helping to secure the bank against cyber threats. Why would anyone attack me? I'm just someone in HR, and that's the sort of, I guess, the initial response that we've had to correct and build that culture of resilience and that culture of cyber security into the organization.
Yeah, and actually, it's kind of like a dual-edged sword, because like there's an expectation, I think, from a lot of employees that they're increasingly open. They want access to internal services very, very, very quickly. They kind of like, they don't like kind of like friction within their kind of employee experience at all. But on the other hand, most reconnaissance from cyber attacks are going to come from kind of like social media gathering, kind of like gathering information on LinkedIn, etc. But it's very difficult to say to like your employees, actually, we're, as an organization, we need to make sure that X, Y, and Z, and we're maintaining the integrity of what you do outside of just like our enterprise, is definitely a cultural shift as well.
I mean, I know that this video is being hopefully watched by lots of people on LinkedIn.
Yes.
But and LinkedIn, as an example of a platform, is exceptional for getting access to really interesting information like this video, but also really good and very useful for stalking people to find out what they're up to, where they work, where they've been, etc. If you get someone come through with responding to a job ad, your first port of call is generally going to be Google and LinkedIn to find out a bit more about them. And I know that we had incidents in the past where LinkedIn has been used to harvest information around organization and the likely responsibilities and access that individuals might have within organizations, quite successfully. Some organizations as well. And so it's that double-edged sword, that it's really useful as a professional to hire people to sort of seek out your next greatest whatever it may be, but it's also really helpful for a criminal to be able to work out how they're going to compromise an organization and achieve their goal and their objective as well. What do you think? So we talked about training and we talked about some of the threats, but what are the sort of top 5 threats? And it's okay to kind of go over, I think we've covered some of the, maybe the top 5 threats to an organization. It's just sort of generic threats that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, so the really interesting thing is kind of like having the diversity of kind of like background and experience that I had coming from government, which is, I still think we have to remember that this is ultimately a crime type. And actually a large amount of the attack vectors that come, so you can say, look, there's 3 or 4 kind of like major threats an organization has to be dealt with, but still fundamentally, you're still dealing in cybercrime with kind of like a quite hardened core of a cybercrime ecosystem, which is a criminal enterprise. But the attack vectors that kind of like a large organization would certainly be worried about now, ransomware, and ransomware has kind of been a growing threat and trend for the last 3-4 years, given the kind of the operating models crime groups have. But actually, since COVID has come in, you've seen very, very aggressive ransomware campaigns, increasingly destructive. You see extortion associated with ransomware campaigns as well. Second big thing, which has been a major trend in kind of like in the news as always, linked to some nation state activity, has been the solar winds attack. That was an example of supply chain attacks. It's actually something that you've seen over a number of years where advanced actors are looking to compromise at scale, and actually kind of compromising organization supply chains is a very, very good way of doing that.
And we saw that with WannaCry and another ransomware around the same sort of time, right? That was really supply chain attack that spat out into collateral damage in many other firms.
Yeah, 100%. And that's something really difficult for a big organization to deal with, which is like the first problem most organizations are dealing with is like just having visibility of their supply chain. You know, obviously we came from like major international organizations. The sheer scale of kind of like what constitutes an organization's supply chain is a significant task to even for most organizations to deal with, and it's a costly one at that as well. And then your question, which is, well,
becomes interesting as well, because like we had there was a Google outage a couple of weeks ago, and it lasted for an hour or so. But the fourth party impact of that was that a lot of people are using Google for their authentication engines, for their third party solutions that are providing to people. And so you couldn't get into Slack, you couldn't get into a whole bunch of stuff because Google had an issue, ironically probably caused by patching for a different issue. But it's it's kind of that those layers of separation now.
yes,
Third, fourth, fifth, sixth party, and at some point you might find it post cloud that every road leads to Azure or AWS or Google or Oracle or whatever it may be as a hosting provider and a cloud service provider. Or it could be everyone leads to Accenture or to IBM or whoever it is, and it's kind of tracing that and understanding the relationships and understanding all those different layers is very complex.
yeah, and I think the Google example was a really interesting example, because I suppose what do you do about what real kind of like leverage do you have as an organization on having resilience when you're dependent on such a large technology provider like downstream, etc. Because we talk about this, one of the programs that we run at the WEF, which is kind of like what does the future of CNI look like? So if you're critical national infrastructure and you say like an electricity grid, etc., there's like clear service agreements about like what you have access to and kind of what happens if kind of like that availability goes down. But if your business is dependent on a large tech provider,
it's all generally contained within one box as well in a sort of an electricity company, so it's quite easy for you to understand it. But yeah, when you get into the tech side of it, it becomes quite challenging.
Yeah.
And I think that you end up like again, so if you look at the analogy between energy and technology hosting is really a commoditized homogeneous environment, right? This is it. You can have A, B, or C, whereas the energy solution is built for the problem and the requirements using commoditized components, but nevertheless it's built in a very specific way.
Yes.
And so that leverage, to your point, back onto some of these hosting service providers, the benefits of moving to a commoditized homogeneous hosting environment are that it's the ease of adoption. It's very clear, how to get there, etc. But it also means that the leverage and the pressure you can put on people to make changes just for you goes away, and then maybe erodes the benefit and the value that you have in scale at that. And so I think there's a lot probably coming with some of these service providers. They might have an option D for high brand, high availability financial services, an option E for government agencies, or an option F for the other government agencies.
Yes.
So
and actually, if you're a regulator, if you're a government, is there like a new generation of regulation coming in that's going to kind of is it acceptable for a large institution, like systemically important institution like Barclays, etc., is dependent on this provider and actually kind of potentially impacted its services? Well, actually, what does the Bank of England think about that? Because they regulate this type of space.
Well, you've got like DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, that's just come out in Europe for consultation,
Ah, okay.
which actually focuses exactly on this. I mean, it's broader. It sort of follows in the footpath of or the footsteps, sorry, of the operational resilience discussion papers and white papers that the PRA and the FCA and the Bank of England have put out, and the US regulators have put out as well. But it starts to focus a lot more on technology third-party providers.
Mhm.
And that's interesting to, and fourth parties, right? It's interesting to start seeing that there's an attempt to see how they can bring legislation and perhaps oversight into those sectors. And I know this is probably going on a massive tangent, but on technology companies, because if you look at the likes of Amazon and Apple and Google, they all have a payment solution, but none of them have a bank.
Yes,
And and you have to think that a lot of the reason why they didn't want to do that is they didn't want the regulations that go with being a deposit taker in most countries.
100%. Yeah.
But if they're going to get oversight by the regulators anyway for being a third-party technology company, and they treat the legal entity the same way regardless of the services that are provided, then it might actually kickstart an industry of creating these challenger banks coming out of technology companies. Which again, complete tangential conversation, but I'm
Actually,
really
super
interested to see how it
interesting.
goes. You know, if you're going to have regulations anyway, you might as well go for all of them.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that at all. But that is a super interesting kind of like impacts, like the incentives of like the
Yeah.
what might happen.
Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry. Back to threats. Back to cyber
Yeah.
threats. So what about insider threat? Because I know that I remember our ex-boss that we had. You know, I sat in a meeting, my first meeting with him, and he sort of drew this triangle of threats, and going from the sort of individual, what I used to call sort of script kiddies that just
Yeah.
sit in the bedroom and are hacking for fun, like Gary McKinnon, for example. I would put him in that category of someone that just wanted desperately to find some evidence of aliens. And then you've got sort of insider threat, which is sort of disgruntled employees, I would say, or one side of it, and one is probably employees that are influenced by um, nation states or criminal gangs. And then you get into the sort of pure criminal, and then nation state, which could be nation state sponsored or nation state themselves. And you get sort of increasing complexity and potential impact as you go further down that pyramid.
Yes.
So insider to me is one that seems quite scary and worrying, because you get, how do you protect an organization from someone who's just annoyed? You know, I think one of the Sony issues was disgruntled employees that they had a few years ago, where people thought they were going to be made redundant, I think, and they just kind of deleted a whole bunch of stuff and caused some and published a whole bunch of stuff. And that, you know, that to me is and I'll check that because I might be incorrect. But you know, that is a scary thing as an organization. Like, I've got someone who I've employed to maintain the databases, therefore they got privileged access to those databases, therefore they have access to the backups of those databases. So if somebody really wanted to destroy our books and records of our company, they could blat production and the backup at the same time, and there's not much I can do about it.
Yeah. Insider threat was it was really fascinating kind of like topic to be able to kind of like engage on, because you were dealing with all the way from kind of like what we'd almost call like accidental insider threat, where it was like, actually I'm going to send this file onto kind of like my Gmail account from my work account because it's like I just want to work on my laptop,
Yeah.
all the way to kind of like, actually I'm being actively recruited by kind of like a crime gang, and I'm going to do some work in I'm going to make sure that I'm creating mule accounts and all the rest of it.
This new crime gang, Cuddly Bear.
um, I found it. I mean, a lot of people are putting investment in user behavior analytics,
Yeah.
like deal with this, which was like a really fascinating technology type that was, in many ways, it was kind of like mirroring the same discussion that was happening in kind of like core cybersecurity discussions, which is we can't deal with the volume of data. We actually need to start using artificial intelligence to detect kind of like anomalies and patterns, etc.
Yeah.
And obviously, there was a lot of investment coming in from a cybersecurity perspective, like EDRM tooling, etc., to kind of like do that and detect and respond. But it was basically the same concepts of how you were actually trying to scale like an insider threat detection as well. And you ended up with quite a lot of organizations, I think, investing in both technologies. And then actually, as an organization, trying to actually like operationally run them types of technologies, and the skills and data that you need to be able to run those are incredibly complex.
But it also feels like there's a place for managers there as well. Coming back to the human behavior, like actual, rather than using AI and algorithms to try and spot blips and anomalies in human behavior, actually using our eyes and ears in how our colleagues and our staff are feeling.
Yes, 100%. Yeah,
There may be some very obvious indicators that somebody is feeling
dissatisfied.
disgruntled, right? Or if they are, you know, like their house has been repossessed and they're getting divorced and whatever, there may be some indicators that they could be suffering from financial issues that may make them more susceptible to bribes, basically, and coercion from criminal activity. So there are things like that we can use as well, right? So it comes back to human behavior, and you know, you've got humans that need to be trained to not click on stuff. You've got people that need to make sure they're keeping an eye on their employees and their colleagues.
Yeah, and it's a good point about, do you as security professionals just increasingly, when you look at security risks, do you just automatically go to a technical solution when actually there's a whole layer of kind of like other things that you should be doing as an organization, to kind of like maintain like resilience and maintain kind of like integrity from these types of threats? It's like you said, who knows the employees best than the organization itself, right?
And actually, I was having a chat with Richard Bell, who's another friend of mine, and we were doing a conversation, a follow up to a location independent working blog post that I did, and that video will go up soon as well, or may already be up, depending on when I get around to doing editing all this stuff. But he came up with a great point, which is that we have a real challenge now with location independent working, and I made this point in my blog as well, that you don't see your people anymore.
Yes.
You can't feel them that much, and I don't mean that in a physical kind of grabbing them sense. I mean in the empathy connection tends to be lost, because when you're in a room with someone, and I have this thing about smelling other humans, right? Humans need to smell other humans, right? It's a kind of a community thing, like as a species, we like that sort of stuff. But you know, when you're in the same room with someone, you can sense if they're stressed, sense if they're upset, sense if they're happy. You can actually pick up on that without people bawling their eyes out or cackling or whatever it may be. But you lose that through this, right? And you then, if you've got people that are starting to disengage on team meetings by switching the cameras off or not turning up, yeah, those could be indicators in their own right that there's something you need to
Yeah.
do. But if you're in charge of a team of 100 people and two screens are off, you're probably going to miss it. And so there are some more complexities with location independent working. Some of it will become easier post COVID, because there's a lot of background stress that people are suffering at the moment in all these lockdowns. But it becomes more challenging as we move to that. But I do think, to your point, right? There's always two sides to a solution in resilience generally, but I think particularly in cyber, for insider, right? There's the what does the manager think about this person, or colleagues think about this person? Are they worried about them? Are there any behavioral indicators that they've seen just by working with them day in, day out? And what does technology tell us that
Yes.
correlate that, or vice versa, right? So there could be a correlation between what UBA is spitting out and what the manager is seeing as well. So you could, you know, I think we have to sort of correlate between observations by humans and observations by technology to get a richer view.
Yeah, and what you said about location, like location independent working, hugely challenging. I can imagine for people doing this, because it's like you said, it's just the infrastructure setups as well are um, much more difficult to be able to kind of like monitor effectively. Like you said, you know, how can you really know if somebody's working remotely for months, if somebody's taking kind of like screenshots on their phone,
Yeah.
you know, and kind of like, as opposed to if they're sat in an office, it's quite obvious if somebody's taking, you know, kind of.
In some cases, wouldn't be allowed to take their phone into that room, if depending on what role they're doing. So, yeah,
Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it?
and we talked about this just before we came on, which is a lot of people are in situations where they're, you know, in shared spaces and they're in shared houses, and you know, you've got lots of kind of people probably, you know, in not particularly optimal working from home conditions as well, right? You know, so very difficult for an enterprise to put control space around that.
Because we can't do background checks on everyone's housemates, and we can't put technology on everyone's housemates' computers because they don't belong to us, and other companies will have that hopefully installed on there, or their personal devices. So there's a kind of, and I think that's where you get the sort of pragmatism around the balance of risks on these discussions, because
Yeah.
but it is a worry, right? And it's something which so far through lockdown nothing has spat out, but I'm sure at some point there'll be some issues related to this, and we'll have to work through them in various companies.
You
So
said, I think the biggest thing I think is what you said, which is the psychological impact of working from home for such a protracted period of time. How, like, it's very easy for employees to start disengaging from their employer.
yeah,
And I think that is a big risk that's kind of like building up, which is not only for performance and kind of productivity issues, but like, yeah, as a security issue, it's very, very easy to start disengaging from an employee that you've not actually seen for an employer that you've not seen for 12 months.
yeah, yeah.
And
I
you've got,
there's a lot that we're going to have to codify in the way that we operate in this new normal,
yes,
which is ironic because in some cases we're sort of putting people into an environment that they should feel more comfortable in because they're near their loved ones, but in many cases they are by themselves, and that sort of compounds the problem. So there's a lot that we'll learn. And as Richard, when I was chatting to him, was saying, we are slightly overwhelmed at the moment because we've got the lockdown and COVID and other stresses. So people are at home and they're worried about whether they're going to get ill, or they're worried about their friends and family about whether they're going to get ill and seriously ill. And they're worried about when there's light at the end of a tunnel. They're worried about whether they're going to have a job at the end of it. They're worried about whether the government payouts are going to stop. There's a lot of background worry at the moment that is sort of distracting people from thinking about, do I actually like working from home? Because you've sort of been told you must by the government, and at some point the government will say, we're out of this, there's been enough vaccinations, so you can go back to normal. And that's when some of the other worries will start to come out, and some of the mental health issues will probably start to become a bit more apparent. But that's a whole other topic of conversation.
very much so, yeah. But yeah, like you said, I think there'll be companies that will be putting an awful lot of investment in what, almost like what you call like the ethics of working from home, and like I was speaking to some large consultancies, and they're definitely in this space, which is like a lot of their clients are saying, what are the things that we should be helping our employees do? Like, do you enforce, well, actually, we only want employees working 8 hours on screen, which means that we're going to shut the screen down, or kind of like give warnings, etc. How can you actually build this in practice?
Yeah.
I think people are just working more, and the blurred lines between work and home and all the rest of it. It's not cyber security kind of like issue.
No, it's not. It's well, I mean, it is in a sense that people are burning themselves out.
Yes.
Right. And so they may be more likely to make a mistake, and that mistake might be a fat finger error, or it could be that the mistake may be that they find themselves influenced by someone, or some email, or whatever it may be. So it does have an implication. I think, yeah, particularly where people don't have spaces that they can lock themselves away. And I'm lucky I've got a space that is not used for anything except me, which is clear by the amount of detritus in here of my life, that I'm not allowed to have in any other part of the house, because it's yeah, kids don't like it. And but I think that yeah, again, that is another topic of conversation, but it's something which will continue to burn through over the coming months, and probably years, as we find out, as we settle down into how that's going to work. So when I talk about resilience, or think about resilience, I have this sort of two sides to resilience. And I do this talk before. Some people have heard me say that business continuity is dead, long live resilience. And what I mean by that is that resilience, business continuity and disaster recovery in a sort of technology view of the world was really looking at the least likely, most highest impact scenarios, and those that were in need of recovery of some sort. So it's basically, something bad has happened, now I need to recover from it. Let's think about all the bad things that could happen that would have a big impact, that need a large heavy lift recovery, and write that all down and make sure that we're ready for it, make sure we've got crisis protocols wrapped around it, and make sure we've tested it and exercised it and everyone knows their roles, etc.
Yeah.
And then the other side of it, when you think about resilience more broadly, is stopping that thing happening in the first place. So building that resistance to failure into the system. I think you've touched on a number of elements of how we can build that resistance to a failure driven by a cyber scenario or an event. And we talked about people training. We talked about intruder detection and some of the other detection software that can actually find things as they're before maybe they've actually had a chance to get a foothold in the organization. Is there anything else you can think of that sits in that protection or that proactive element prior to recovery that we should be thinking about from a cyber resilience perspective?
Yeah, so it might be slightly left field, apart from like it's definitely my experience, like when we're engaging like with the WEF with very senior leadership, which is there are lots of things you can do as an organization to kind of invest in kind of like protecting yourself as an organization, technology, people, process, etc. But really the difference with cybersecurity is you have to start thinking about you as part of like a much wider ecosystem. And actually the concept of like you need very, very robust public-private partnerships, and kind of like you as an organization should be really investing in kind of like your local and international cybersecurity ecosystem. And you also should be building relationships through your government affairs people about what are we doing as kind of like a public policy, like how are we dealing with this as a public policy issue to try and reduce kind of the threat and the risk to businesses operating, for example, in the UK. And being actively part of that process and actively part of that ecosystem is something that we're hugely trying to encourage. And a good example of this is the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, the active cyber defence programme that they've had, that's hugely dependent on public-private partnerships, large institutions, financial services institutions that are kind of like part of that dialogue. And the work that, say, the UK's done with internet service providers, which is blocking large-scale malware campaigns like upstream from like a backbone perspective, is part of how you're stopping the attack even getting towards you, right? Or, you know, are you investing in helping the National Cybercrime Unit investigate, you know, your attacks, and you're giving them credible data to help with attribution and investigation of the crime? So I think when we think about what can you do to stop it, there's lots of stuff that you could do within your organization. But I think the difference with cybersecurity is you have to start investing in what we call like you have to invest in the ecosystem, which is you have to invest in kind of like peer partnerships, competitor partnerships, and public policy partnerships, tactically, operationally, and strategically. And actually, that's a big mindset shift for a lot of organizations, that they're having to do that because it's different, it's expensive, it requires different types of skills as well. You know, which, you know,
so it requires potentially sort of pulling your trousers down in public a little bit as well. So you're admitting where perhaps something has happened to your organization, and you're telling other organizations about the threat, about the TTP. So you end up that they're not, so they don't impact that organization or any other parts of critical national infrastructure, whatever it may be that you're trying to help by sharing that information. You know, it's important to kind of culturally say it's okay to admit failure. We're not going to publish this to the world, but we're just going to share it amongst these safe groups to ensure that that protection can be put there at a national level.
Yeah, and it's for senior leadership, providing your teams with kind of like the legal clarity, the processes, and the governance of doing that effectively is a significant investment, I think, for them to do. Because, like you said, it's a big risk, I think, for a lot of organizations culturally to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in organizations we've worked with, we've really benefited from collaboration between other financial services companies to better combat some of the threat actors that have come after financial services, to the point where, you know, we may have helped with the response for another organization,
Yes,
and that has helped us and other financial services companies be protected against that threat or that attack if it was to happen. And in many cases, they have happened, but we haven't been hit, because in financial services in the UK in particular, I mean, everywhere, frankly, but you know, there is no winner, there's no prize for being the best at cybersecurity. Because if, you know, I'm naming names, but let's say if Barclays was to suffer an outage and HSBC still need to send payments to us, right? We still need to send payments to HSBC. We still need to clear payroll for people that may bank with Lloyd's or TSB or Santander or whoever it may be, right? So there's no winner, but there is a sector-wide winner as well.
It's like it's about providing integrity in the entire system.
I just had to say thank you to the delivery drivers so they wouldn't just stand there and stare at me through the window.
Well, what's been interesting, like in this role though, is I think we were incredibly lucky actually in US and European financial services that there actually was that type of ecosystem. Yes, there was challenges, but actually I think there was a lot of maturity between those organizations from other threats and risks, and there's like a lot of governance that's emerged over a long time for dealing with different threats and risk types. But when you start going into different countries and different sectors, some of that underpinning architecture just doesn't exist, and also some of the larger, where we, used to work, they had the resources to do it.
Yeah, we recognize the importance of it, invested in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's move on to recovery. So we talked about being resistant to failure, and I think there's a lot of takeaways there as well. But what if it happens? What if you do suffer a ransomware attack or some other data breach or something that's some cyber attack in a nebulous sense, or a denial of service attack, whatever it is, right? What then? How do you recover from it? How do you make sure you're better than every time you're better than you were last time?
Yeah. So in many ways, Mike, it's kind of like you've touched on this yourself, which is how much of this are you exercising, like within your how much of this are you exercising, how much of this do you have like kind of like embedded in the kind of like DNA of the organization, depending on the severity of the incident. I think obviously when you work at a SOC and you work at, like you're dealing with incidents all the time and you're getting better and sharper, etc., and you're improving your operational processes. The difficulty was the things that you weren't expecting and that you hadn't exercised for and you didn't have capability for. And I think a lot of those resilience practices that you've talked about, exercising, crisis management, etc., were very important to that. And I think there's a difference between the kind of operational security and technology teams as opposed to kind of the senior management. We deal a lot with chief communication officers here. And basically the kind of like the consensus is cybersecurity is the number one issue that they as an organization now and in the future has to deal with for like major crisis management. And obviously which basically means it's the most likely thing that they have to communicate to their employees and their customers about what they're dealing with. And there's some great examples of how it's not done very well. Some not naming and shaming, but I remember Talk like back in 2014 was kind of like a maybe not how to do it, but organize. So that's a difference about.
Yeah, to be fair to the CEO at the time that was communicating, that was probably the first time that we had that scale of cyber attack that was so publicly, it was so public, right? And had to have a CEO of a company stand up and explain what had happened. And so she was being led by an awful lot of guidance, whether it's from the police or from her internal security or comms and legal, etc., and had like all these tension to try and communicate something credible that meant something to the customers.
Yes.
And it's not any, I wouldn't want to be in in her shoes when she was talking. And I think that to being a good case study for others to learn about how to deal with it. And I'm sure you're about to talk about that just now, but it's a good case study to think about how to do things a little bit better.
Yeah, and you've definitely seen improvements, right, about communications about how to do it well.
I think one of the things that we did a lot of these exercises with journalists as well, and try to get them to help us to communicate effectively to our customers if something was to happen. And one of the key points that I took away from that was it's a crime, and you said it before. This is a crime.
Yeah.
And so we have been the victim of a crime, and you are therefore part of that that crime has been affected by that crime that's been perpetuated against us and you as customers. And but we
Yes.
care about you, therefore we are going to make it better as best
Yeah.
as we can, and we'll look after you. And I think that sort of clarity of message that the journalists are saying, just try and be very clear. Don't bamboozle with techno jargon and ifs,
Yeah.
buts, and maybes. And well, just be very clear. We suffered a crime. You've been caught up in it. We're going to make it better.
Yeah. And I think that's like a major thing for maybe like the cyber teams, why they need kind of like good oversight and good like processes around them, because we often do get sucked into the tech, and actually not, basically no, I don't think many people are particularly interested in the tech when you're doing that type of kind of like recovery, which is like you do not need to tell them what kind of like encryption methodology that you had for what database and the rest of it. It's like
Vulnerability may have been involved in blah 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 blah.
yeah,
Nobody cares. Well, they don't care. Yeah, but you do need to tell them that here is the data that's been put at risk. It's
yeah,
your password, therefore your action should be change your password. It's your date of birth and your postal address. Unfortunately, we're not suggesting you change your date of birth or postal address, but we have reported it to the Information Commission Officer, and you need to be aware of potential fraud against you. And here's some training of how to deal with fraud. Yeah, and it's things like that. But don't worry, your money's safe as long as you follow these steps, and we're underwriting this and da 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 da.
yeah. And actually, we forget like how quickly all this happened. I don't know. When Top was what 2014. I mean,
Yes.
6 years ago. And actually, it's not long at all, right? Most organizations have had to go through this type of like transformation in like 18 months, 24 months, etc. And
2015 was Talk. There we go.
yeah, I mean, it's not long at all, right?
Yeah, the end of 2015. Not long at all. And we've learned a lot, as we've had more data breaches. Equifax, I think, again, taught us as an industry a lot about the risk and the impact and how to deal with things. BA, I think, did a pretty decent job in putting some big ads up and being very clear about the impact and how seriously they took it. So I think there's been incremental improvements every time there's been an issue. Unfortunately, Talk happened to be one of the first big ones to go. There were other ones before, like Experian and a few others that happened before it, but they probably didn't have the headline grabbing ability that Talk did.
Yeah, and like you said, it's not pointing the finger at
No.
any organization at the time, because it could have been anyone, right? In many ways, yeah.
And that's a really good point, right? This could have happened to anyone.
Yes.
And it's happened to more people since. So it will happen again. So it could happen to your company from people watching it. Could happen to you personally.
I think actually I probably need to check. Apart from like Facebook, like dealt with something very very similar. I think it was probably less. It was last year where it was kind of Facebook has detected an incident. We know cybercrime is one of the kind of like greatest threats that we have to deal with collectively. We are doing everything that we can, and that's a major. And I actually remember at the time thinking just how things had moved on and like how kind of like good it was actually.
Yeah, it was a password breach. They had password and clear text off, and they've discovered it on a. I'm just looking up the details.
I have to look it up. Yeah, the comms they put out around it.
Yeah, it was 267 million. No, it was 100,000 compromised password on a on a pastebin dump in 2020. But and unfortunately, I think the reality as an individual on planet Earth at the moment, an individual on planet Earth with a smartphone or any sort of device that's connected to the internet, most of our PII data has already been stolen, right?
Yeah.
So our date of birth, our email address, our old passwords, hopefully they're old passwords. People watching, change your password. And almost certainly some of our credit card numbers are out there, our challenge questions, some of the answers are out there, and postal addresses, they're already out there. If you have ever bought anything online, if you've used social media, if you probably already have a large proportion of your data out there. And so certainly if the password managers now even my VPN client, it tells me that I've got exposed credentials in the dark web. So we know that, and that's helpful because it tells you, like, I'm going to go and change my password. And if you go to haveibeenpwned.com, you can find out a bit more about where you've been, where your email may be there and what other data has been breached. But it's, as an individual, most of us have got most of our private data is already out there somewhere. So there's not an awful lot that we can protect apart from our most recent passwords and our most recent bank details and our most recent challenge information. Yeah, which is a sobering thought.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is like I don't think we're particularly good still at articulating, particularly even to government, which is like where does this? And I agree about the kind of large scale kind of like PII that's out there. Like where does the risk manifest itself? And actually, you know, a lot of the risk manifests itself in the financial institutions as kind of like secondary, tertiary, fraud. You know, it was social kind of engineering fraud. It was kind of like stuff that kind of fueled all this other kind of crime. But it was very difficult to say, well, this came from this data breach that was kind of like in this gym company. And actually, the banks did absorb, I think, a lot of the kind of like the impact of financially motivated cybercrime, but it was very difficult to be able to piece together how this kind of like much larger ecosystem of data breaches was fueling kind of all these other different types of crime, etc. And which is why I think it is a public policy issue as well. Which is in many ways it was like it made the banks and financial services and payment providers were having to kind of like invest an awful lot in kind of like fraud detection technology that actually was coming from all these kind of like, you know, weak passwords and kind of like et cetera, et cetera. So,
and that gives, so at the individual level, it gives you an increased likelihood of fraud based on how much data Mike Butler has out in the public domain that could be leveraged to make fraudulent transactions on my account or gain access to my account or take over my Netflix account, whatever it may be, you know, stuff that's really important to me, particularly in lockdown and unemployment. But, you know, it's stuff like that. But I think if you, coming back to the sort of corporate things, we were talking about communication, and we've done a lot of exercises that have told us what companies need to get better at. And it pretty much is communication, because we've got good people in most companies now in the technology side that will go and solve whatever problem that is and try and bring the systems online again. And we've got good people in cybersecurity that are going to be there to help look at mitigating controls and measures to like block the baddies or whatever it may be. We've got comms people inside, we've got legal people, all the building blocks are there for us to be able to create an appropriate response. But publicly and to our employees and our colleagues, we need to be very clear about what's happened and what happens next.
Yes.
And that's pretty much the main learning of everything we have. And also, don't interfere with your recovery teams, right? They're the experts. Don't try and be, because you just happen to be the most senior person on a call.
Yes.
You're not the expert in the thing. So just let everyone do their job, but make sure you've got them the air cover when they need to escalate, and make sure you're there to be able to communicate appropriately to all interested parties, which are generally in our sector regulators, customers, the information controller, and shareholders and boards, etc. And so when you've got all that in place and you get credible comms out, then that allows you to make sure that you're fixing the problem, restoring service, and at the same time you're communicating regularly to customers so they understand what's happening and their expectations are set as well. Absolutely. Is there anything else you think that we should be passing on to the watchers of this on how you can better prepare yourself to recover from these types of events? You know, cyber insurance is something which gets put out there quite a bit. I know my son has got that in place. If they get bricked devices, they've got insurance they can claim against.
Yeah, so kind of like risk transfer and liability transfer and like the insurance market is like definitely a big topic. I think there's still a lot of discussion about the effectiveness of cyber insurance, etc., and that is definitely a maturing industry.
Yeah,
like what constitutes effective cover, what is in the cover, what do you as kind of like what's the responsibilities that you have as a party to be able to do that.
And it seems like pre-agreed commercial rates with consulting firms to come in and help with the clear up. So you're not coming to them after the event, you've agreed it up front. So you've got a kind of a more palatable bill.
Well, I think like you said, we talked about this, where it's actually the kind of cyber threats and cyber attacks that you're going to suffer from as an organization. You can basically model most of them, and a lot of organizations have red teams and red teaming services, etc. So actually kind of like being quite clear about, well, this type of ransomware attack that's going to like impact this type of system, etc. What is our response to it? Actually, a lot of the pre-work can already be done, right? And yes, the malware is going to change, some of the technical TTPs are going to change, but broadly, we've actually got the attack categories, and the impact and how it's going to manifest itself in the business is actually already well known. So actually you can kind of like build like resilience plans, I think, quite effectively for those types of scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know ransomware is the big one, where it's been the big question a lot of organizations have dealt with is, do we pay or not pay?
Yeah. And I think, each organization needs to take their own legal advice as to what they're going to do and look at their jurisdictional restrictions and their ability to do that as well.
Completely, yeah.
So what about these vaults? There's all these like cyber vaults that are in there. I know you've got a lot of the tech companies now are starting to sell solutions to provide an air-gapped or virtual air-gapped vault solution for like almost a doomsday vault if the worst was to happen to their production platforms, that they've got something there that has the data out. You've got Sheltered Harbor in the US, which provides a sort of end-of-day view of transactions for financial services companies as well, so that you can almost operate. You've got a balanced view, at least for clients, customers, and assets, that allows you to sort of restart the bank with the appropriate infrastructure. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Much experience with the vaults?
I don't have much kind of like operational experience with that, but I would say that a lot of organizations, given that specifically the ransomware threat, are looking at this type of solution and whether it's effective for their organization, given that we think it's obviously kind of like the biggest threat that's out there. And increasingly you are having very, very aggressive campaigns that are destructive in nature. Yeah. And are kind of like very adept at like finding backups and deleting backups, etc. And you've got a large compromise, which means that you are increasingly looking at these very, very kind of these solutions, which are I won't say doomsday, but I would say that like there's obviously a lot of sense for organizations to explore those kind of like technical solutions, given that the threat is manifesting itself in this way. And actually there's been a lot of successful campaigns and criminal campaigns that have been quite destructive for organizations. So it makes a lot of sense that people are looking at that. You're probably thinking though, if those types of solutions are being actually operationalized, you've probably done quite, I wouldn't say things wrong, but people have gone quite far down the line of like there's lots of things that you can do to stop people being able to attack you in that type of impact. So most of the ransomware campaigns that would like require that type of response is still delivered through malspam and still delivered through kind of like, malware that you could detect through your kind of ordinary email kind of like detection mechanisms, So I would say that, that makes a lot of sense given where the threat landscape is going. I would say though that, that there's we used to do the kill chain, right? There's an awful lot of controls that you have to get to before you're in that space.
You got lots of locks on your door before you go to the safe room.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah,
house that you can focus on first.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I think to your point, there are specific scenarios where it could help, and there are other scenarios, sort of creeping death scenarios, where it's probably less helpful. But your other detection and controls are quite useful there. I also do think that most companies need to make sure they don't forget how to do things manually.
Yes.
So when you've got a reliance on STP payments, straight through processing payments, that's great because you can do high volume and you're only looking at breaks at that point. But at the same time, don't forget how to do it manually using your own kind of interfaces into central banks, into payment providers, because at some point, if they're, even if they're down just because of technology issues, you want to make sure you can do some of your end of day payments, meet some of your obligations, that you know what your balances are, etc. And we've explored that in a number of scenarios as well. And it's not just payments. Payments is just one big area of concern, I think, but there's a lot of things that make sure your manual processes are well understood to be able to deal with the lack of the ability to transact through the systems. I think we've covered quite a lot in our time, Will, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Is there any sort of final thoughts from you before we wrap?
Yeah, like thanks, Mike, for kind of inviting me. I've enjoyed the conversation. I think the main thing I would say about cybersecurity for businesses is this is like going to be the dominant risk that you're going to be dealing with, for the short, medium, and long term. Increasingly, as most organizations invest and become technology businesses, and they're increasingly dependent on complex technical processes for their value offering, cybersecurity is like absolutely integral to kind of like maintaining resilience, not only kind of like in the classic sense, but resilience in the sense of the survivability of their business, which is, if you're increasingly becoming a technology company, you've got to make sure that cybersecurity is a kind of integral part of your strategy as well as a business.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Will. Good luck with 2021. I hope it brings you lots more challenge and excitement to add to your new baby.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll speak soon.
Thanks very much, Mike.